what you have to do with regard to contracts, the actual prime contract and subcontract. So, I'll use the example from yesterday. So I was in with the government, we had our kickoff meeting, and there were questions that they raised of additional things that they wanted that were not in the original contract. So I need to give them prices for those things. They need to incorporate that into the contract baseline, and then we'll sign the contract. So right now, those are open prime contract issues for us to resolve before they sign. And then because of that, they want me to do something that I don't have the capability to do. I have to bring the subcontractor. I have to go back to a sub, get prices, and be able to enter into a subcontract with them to be able to provide the services. You would also have to initiate any service level agreements. We can talk about that, that's important. And then think about it as a chess match. You want to link people up who are like-minded, right? So you want your contracts person, or the person who performs your contracts function, coupled with the government contracting officer, because they speak the same language. You want your program manager, who's going to run the whole contract, tied joined with their program manager or their contracting officer representative. We'll talk about them in a second, because they speak the same language. And you want to do the same thing with your subcontractors, because if I'm a technical person and I talk to the contracts people, they're not going to know what I'm talking about. So we want to make sure that you're having like people talk to each other. And you also want to make sure that you understand what is it going to take to get your product or service accepted. So in your RFP, there were acceptance criteria, and if it's a commercial item, it should just be a visual inspection that you provided the product. But you just want to make sure that you're clear of how you will submit acceptance documents, what form you want, the government wants to see that acceptance document so that they can accept it and you can submit for payment. And then you want to work with DFAS, because they're the payment arm, to figure out how their process works. During performance, the contract activities they focus around making sure the contract is managed well, by making sure the work, deliverables, and products are correctly delivered on time. So a lot of times you have one contracts person in your company who's dealing with a whole lot of contracts. So it's up to the program manager for your individual contract to make sure that all the work gets done. But if there are problems, you always want to make sure you bring your contracts person in on the discussion as to, like, if you're late on a deliverable, or if you weren't able to provide the right number of resources on the deliverable, you want to make sure your contracts person is aware of that so they can have conversations with their counterpart. You want to make sure that correctly skilled people are working on the contract. You want to make sure that you're managing that acceptance process that we talked about, the payment process, and that you resolve any contractual issues as they occur. So let's say, for example, the government says, hey, we have this emergency, and we need you to do this extra work right away. Here's the requirements. I know you don't have time to price it right now. We need you to get started on the work. Would you do it?
No.
So here is my rule of thumb. If the contracting officer asked me to do it, I would do it. If the program manager told me to do it, I wouldn't do it. Why do you think I make that differentiation?
Because she makes the decision on whether or not to add it to the contract.
Right. The program manager is much like all of us, right? We have crises, things get behind, and now all of a sudden we expect everybody to run around firefight, right? Because we let things fall apart. So just because the program manager does that doesn't mean that the government as a whole has decided it's in the best interest for the government for us to rush and do something like that. Whereas the contracting officer, if the contracting officer is talking to me, what do I know for sure?
That's just that she wants it done.
It's been discussed.
It's been discussed
They're
between
the
the two.
spokesperson for that contract.
Right, that the program manager who has the fire need has talked to the contracting officer, because otherwise the contracting officer wouldn't know about it. And the contracting officer understands what has to be in place, and he or she feels comfortable enough that all that stuff's in place or getting there to be able to give me the okay to work. So from a contractual point of view, I'm at risk either way. But if the contracting officer's telling me my own personal belief system was that I would do it because I know that he or she would know what has to be done to get it finalized. But let's say I did do it based on the program manager, and then the government says, would you please just get started and we'll get the paperwork straightened out later, right? Always a good line. And then let's say I submit my paperwork and the government says, wait a minute, this is really expensive, and you put yourself down for 10% profit? Profit is based on how much risk you have. You don't have any risk, you've already done all the work. This should be a 0% profit. We're gonna have an issue? Yeah, I went out on a limb, and now you're telling me that because the work is already done, you're not gonna give me a profit because it's based on risk. We're gonna have an issue. So at that point, we've got to get that resolved. Now, what bad contractors do is they say, oh, I've got more important stuff to do. I got more important stuff to do. I got more important stuff to do. Until we get, 3 or 4 years down the road, and this issue back here still hasn't been resolved. Well, guess what? When you close out a contract, does this issue have to be resolved? And who remembers all the details of this? Do we remember what happened yesterday? So the closest to the actual event to get the contractual issues taken care of, the better off you're going to be. I worked on a contract where I was brought in on, it was a 10-year contract, and I was brought in on year 9 to close down the contract. And there were things that happened in year 2, and there were so many issues that it ended up being a horse trade. I'll give you leniency on issues 1, 7, 9, and 12 if you give me leniency on issues 2, 6, 3, and 4. Because nobody was on the contract. It was back there in year 1 of the contract. And yet, these contract issues had to get resolved before they closed out. And then, of course, you're going to be modifying the contracts and some contracts as necessary for modifications. The next thing you're going to do is you have to manage the contract during shutdown by ensuring all the work, deliverables, and products are delivered to the last day of the contract, and that you do this orderly shutdown based on the needs of the government. So let's say, for example, you're doing work in San Diego and Norfolk and Mechanicsburg, and the government says, okay, well, we're already finished all the work in San Diego. You can go ahead and shut those subcontracts down. But hold off on Mechanicsburg because that's going to take us maybe a month of transition, and the ones in Norfolk, you can shut down at the end of the contract. So they'll tell you what their plan is for the work so that you shut your subcontracts down accordingly. Because again, it's a pricing issue. You have to complete all the closeout activities as identified by the government. So there's a FAR part that's all about closeout, and you just have to follow all those requirements. Then audit the contract and submit your final invoice over to the government, and make sure you keep copies of everything for 7 years. Okay, any questions about the contract side of the house? All right, let's talk about the people activities. So in the beginning, you've got to make sure you stand up this organization. Now, I'm not saying you need to have a separate and distinct organization from the rest of your organization. You just have to make sure that all the parts fit in with the rest of the organization. So, let's go back to Blue Wolf. If the government orders 10,000 cleaning supplies, they don't need to set up a separate government cleaning supply division. They may choose to do that, but they don't have to do that because they already supply cleaning supplies to a bunch of commercial companies. You can just tuck the 10,000 into that. But you do want to make sure that the people who are doing invoicing and quality control, that they understand what the government requirements are to be able to take on this new work. We talked about locating internal and external people for contract work. Sometimes the government will want to see what salaries you're paying these people. So they'll contact these potential hires and ask them what salary were you promised, because they want to make sure that you're meeting the wage standards. You onboard people to your company, so if they're brand new hires, you need to bring them into your own fold and then tell them specifically what they're doing on this government contract. Sometimes it's going to be required that they have security clearance. This is a nightmare in DC. This is a nightmare pretty much everywhere. Because of the things that happened at the Naval Yard with the shooting by a cleared person, and because of the stuff that happened with, was it Snowden? Yeah, Snowden, who took so much classified information. They are at a snail's pace at getting security clearances approved. So what happens is you're required to, let's say you have to produce 10 cleared people by day one of the contract. You can't get those people cleared until you have a valid reason for why they should be cleared. And until you have that government contract, you don't have that reason. So you start the clock on day one of the contract, and these things can take like a year, you know, a year and a half, because they really are doing more and more in terms of investigations. Has anybody ever been involved in a clearance process? And then anybody like been asked questions about somebody else for a clearance process? Yeah. So you know how detailed it is, right? So they try to conduct more and more thorough investigations of that stuff. But the problem is that you all of a sudden have a resource. So if you go to DC and you go to like a breakfast or a lunch kind of conference, you'll hear people say, "Hey, I'm cleared," if anybody, and people just like gaggle to it because that would be a person they could put on that contract immediately. Because let's face it, if you don't have, okay, besides the ramifications, if you don't provide a full staff on day one of the contract, what other issue do you have if you don't have people?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, you're not going to be able to provide do the task order or the deliverables.
Right, so you're not going to meet contractual obligations. What's the other issue?
You're losing money.
Every day that person is not on the job, you're losing money. Which is why I recommended to you the first week of class, if you want to just get your feet wet on government contracting, go look at Northrop's website. Sam, do we know when, isn't there a company coming in this week?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Look at Northrop's website, look at Raytheon's website. Any of those labor categories that aren't filled, you could talk to them about a subcontractor position, because they're losing money every day on this. And then get the communication channels established, train people in their processes, and then make sure you have everybody with the right equipment and resources so that they can be successful. During performance, you've got this issue to manage. Always a triangle. So if you're a large company, you have stakeholders to manage and profit goals, right? You've got your employees to manage, and you've got your customer to manage. So let's say that you bring Mary on with the customer, and she's a level 1 systems engineer. And Mary's just clicking along, customer loves her, everything's working great. But Mary's been on the contract for 2 years, and what does Mary expect? She expects a raise, right? So in order to give her more money, she's at a bill rate that maybe says the company's getting $60 for every hour she's working. Mary wants to get more money, so we would have to at least be paying her like $75. We have to at least get $75. So what has to happen for Mary in order for her to be able to get that salary increase?
Have to amend the contract or discuss it with the contracting officer to change the terms.
So one thing we could do is she's a systems engineer. She's a systems engineer 1 right now. If we can take her to a 2, we can give her a salary increase. Because it's not prudent for us, if she's at $60 an hour, to give her a salary increase as a systems engineer 1, because that's not being fair to the shareholders and the profit margins we've skipped. Now, obviously, Mary's 1 salary is not going to impact this, but collectively, we can't just give people raises on contracts because we're going to be charging the government less than what our actual expenses are. So we're going to be losing money for every hour that Mary works. So the ideal situation would be to get Mary from an SE1 to an SE2, because the pay range for that is $75 to $90. Well, guess what? We need to pay, we need 75 to be able to pay Mary. But we have to convince Mary that she needs to take on new responsibilities to be an SE2, right? Now, you would think this is an easy sell to get Mary motivated to take SE2, but I will tell you, it's not always an easy sell. Sometimes people are very, very content doing exactly what they're doing. They would like more money for what they're doing, but they're very happy doing what they're doing because they really don't want to learn anything else. Or the big jump is when we're beyond the SE2 or SE3 and we want Mary to jump into being a manager. How many people have been a manager? Are a manager? How many people think it's a pain in the neck?
A small business would be a lot of fun if it wasn't for employees and customers. Just pointing that out.
You are always on as a manager, right? You're always dealing with something. And typically, it's not, how can I provide value add to my customer? It's like,
He's breathing on me.
you know, you got all these issues that you're dealing with, the minutia. That you're like a parent trying to keep kids, fighting kids apart.
Daycare.
Yeah. So, and we wonder, us older folk in the room, why our children, the millennials in the room, don't want to move into managerial positions. Let's face it, we've been bitching about them for years, right? And we can't understand why they don't want to move into that. Because it's just, I'm happy with my job. I leave at 5 and I'm good. You know, it works out perfectly, right?
Sorry about that. I didn't hear.
Sorry about that.
Did you hear?
That was easy.
Yeah. So that's what we're dealing with during contract performance. And then during shutdown, it used to be, we had something called the bench. Does anybody know what the bench is? The bench was sort of a make-believe place that if you weren't, so you know how your companies are split up into 2 groups, the overhead group, right? And if you're in leadership, you're probably in the overhead group. Your contracts people are in the overhead, your marketing people, your invoicing, your finance, all those people are in overhead, right? They don't, for every hour they work, they're not charging the government directly for that hour, right? Whereas your engineers, your manufacturing team, you know, your supply chain people, those are all direct bill for the most part. So for every hour they work, the government's paying them that hourly rate. So when people who are direct bill, the contract, you don't win the contract recompete or you lose the contract, those people are now looking for work. If they're good people, what do you want to do with them?
Keep them.
Keep them. So in the old days, there was enough money to be made in government contracting where you could put those people on the bench. And what that meant is you maybe had them work on a special project, or you had them go take training, or you had them use up vacation time, or whatever, or like take on a new, revamp a process internally. But basically, you let them not be a support person in your company, and they weren't being direct billed, but you were able to sort of keep them on this bench for a while, and they would still get their salary, and you were basically keeping them in the background for when you needed them. And that's happened to me before, because when contracts close out, you know, the next one doesn't automatically start. So, you know, it happens. The problem is that profit margins have gotten much skinnier. You have to be much more competitive, and companies don't have the money for that bench anymore. So a lot of times, if you bring in people to work on this government contract, and you lose this government contract, and you don't have another 1 or 2 or 5 waiting in the wings, you end up having to let those people go, right? Because you can't take on the burden of their salaries because you just don't have the infrastructure to support it. So it becomes a very challenging time for individuals as you're transitioning people off the contract. Now you may be able to, if it's a large company, you know, it might not be the ideal situation, but you know, we'll offer you a job in Timbuktu if you're willing to move. Some people are willing to do that, some people aren't, right? And so all those basically, every person has their own little